Hi, so this is a little video on tessellation. So this has come about because one of the first live classes I was doing this week, we were all set up to do on Zoom for those people who were still unable to attend, and all practiced, all ready to do, and just as we were about to go live, the internet crashed. So wouldn't you just know it? And I think that's been one of the messages of this last year. We've relied so much on technology to get us through and to keep us up to date, but just sometimes when we need it, it disappears. So I'm doing this little video, and it is an introduction to tessellation and little projects that we're going to be doing in my live classes, but of course anybody can have a go. And the one I've picked is this. It's often called just T-squares, but I quite like it as a kimono quilt because that's the shape I can see. So what's tessellation? Well, you might have seen it if you ever attended art classes, where you have two shapes that fit together and they're not a uniform shape. So obviously squares fit together, triangles fit together, but sometimes it's where one shape creates an echo or like a shadow even of its own shape as part of the creation. So the block itself is just one small square just there, but when it's joined with others you get the reflection shape in it, and I just thought it was a bit of fun to do. It's not difficult because it's only actually two half square triangle sizes, and I think the key things to remember with it are, if you're going to make it scrappy, which I like, but I know some people will be running a mile at that. It's like nails down a blackboard. Keep the background fabric the same so that you get the effect. So I've making this as a door hanging because all the doors in the downstairs of my house are glass panelled, which is lovely, lets in lots of light, apart from when you're going to sleep and you want it dark. And so I often make my hangings the length and width of the door. So obviously you could make your square, you can do whatever once you've got the initial block. So with this one, I've then used any fabrics that were, to me, felt remotely oriental, and used those for the kimono sizes of the blocks. But as long as it was a good contrast with the background, you can use whatever you want. And I'd say if you're going to make this just as a practice block, then make a minimum of 4 so that you get this part. So if you were just doing those 4 blocks, you need to do 4 so that you can see the echo of the shape. So have a go with that. But you might have tried tessellation with things like apple core, where the curves fit sideways onto each other, and there are hundreds and hundreds of examples of tessellation, but I just thought we'd try with this one because it's just a bit of fun. So how do we do it? Right, well, I played with various sizes of half square triangles, and the one that I found was the easiest to construct is the one I've put on the opposite side that we're just going to look at in a minute. So from each of the fabrics, so either the kimono part or your background fabric, you need to cut 1 5-inch square. Now, if you want to cut it at 4 7/8, please go ahead and do that. I know some people would rather make it slightly bigger, then they don't have to worry about the seam allowance being slightly out, and then you can trim it to 4 1/2. But we want the finished half square triangle to be 4 1/2 inches. So for this proportions, that's what works. You can of course size it up or size it down, that's entirely up to you. So for your kimono fabric and the background fabric, you need 5-inch square. Now obviously you're going to make 2 half square triangles, so in every one of these you will find the opposite block. So we've got here and we've got here, so there is always the partner or the half of the block. So obviously these will make 2. Now you're going to make half square triangles with those 2. Now the method that I use is I lay both squares on top of each other, right sides together, draw the absolute diagonal and sew 1/4 inch either side of that diagonal so that you're not having raw bias edges. Then cut through the middle, through the absolute diagonal, and press open. So I've pressed to the darker side, so the seam is lying, you can see that the seam is lying there, and then trim to 4.5 inches. Now in this little sample, this is the kimono fabric and this is the background fabric, okay, and that's going to sit there. Now for the smaller squares, I cut 3-inch strips of both of the fabrics, so the kimono fabric and the background fabric. I cut 3 inches across and subcut them into 3-inch squares. So that's 3 inches. So the bigger one is 5, the smaller one is 3. If you want to do it more precisely, it's 2 7/8, but you know, 1/8 of an inch can be tricky. Particularly, the reason why I make it slightly bigger is if when you're doing the stitching 1/4 inch away from the absolute diagonal, if your 1/4 inch is slightly bigger, then your finished square will be slightly smaller. So I give myself that extra 1/8 of an inch and then I prefer to trim. But that's just me. You can do whatever you like. Make half square triangles in exactly the same method as you did before and trim to 2.5 inches. So the bigger one is 4.5 inches, the smaller one is 2.5 inches. And for each little block, you need 5 half square triangle blocks. So you can see we've got 3 going down the side and 2 across the bottom. Okay, now you will obviously have made more. So for the 2 blocks, you will need 10 of the smaller half square triangles and you will have 2 of the larger ones because obviously you've made the opposite block. Now the arrangement for this, bring you a bit closer, has to be the same. So you can't play around with the arrangement because they all have to run in the same direction so that you get the echo shape. So I love my design wall. Those of you that have seen my other videos, I just use a design wall all the time and it works for me because I sit directly opposite it, sideways on, at my machine. So I'm constantly looking at it to check. Now before I joined all the blocks together, I laid them all out on the design wall because it was scrappy so I could see the arrangement and see where the colours are going. There's no pattern in the arrangement as is, they are just random. The only thing is they're not 2 the same sitting next to each other. That's the only rule. So we've got our first block, so the kimono fabric is facing in towards the centre. Now what I've found, if you want to make a whole pile of these at the same time, it actually does get easier to chain piece them because you get into doing them in the same order. So the first things I did is I sewed those 2 together. So you're going to put right sides together and match them so that you're going to sew 1/4 inch down along that edge so that when you open it up you will have something that looks like that, and that forms the side piece to here, and then join those 2 onto there as one piece so that becomes one piece. There's other ways of doing this, but I just found that made more sense to me. Then what I did is I sewed those 2 together because I knew I was almost making that as a flying geese. So I put those 2 together to make that block and I added that piece on to make that unit, and then this section was joined onto this section. Now The only area that you need to be slightly, not just be aware of, is when you're joining these together, is where the seam that runs up the centre of those, match it with the seam that's coming down, and the rest of it won't matter. But if I turn you slightly here, where those pieces are joining into here, there, try and see one, maybe that one's better. That's the only intersection that it will be obvious if your points don't match up, because it doesn't match there apart from sideways, and there's nothing to match with there. So just when you're putting that row on, just try to match it with the seam line that's coming down there and join those together. And then basically that's it. That's all you need to worry about. And then depending on how big you want it to be, you can just keep going. But I think the main criteria is to keep your background fabric the same and keep it plain. Now this has got a slight like a linen blend grain in it. It's still cotton, but that works, I think, as the background. So it's not white, it's not cream, it just works. And then mix all your other fabrics together. So when I then was joining them together, I would sew 2 blocks together, and because I was looking at it all the time, I didn't go too big, and then I sewed mine into rows. So I had 4, and I would join those 4 on, and again the areas that I'm trying to match are just those points as they come across here, because we want those to fit together. But there was no trimming needed after that. It definitely all worked together. Now you could sew them into blocks of 4, make 4 together and join those 4 together, that would work. And if you only want to make 4, just make 4, because they do make quite a nice, quite a nice block if you wanted it as a cushion cover or whatever. But say mine, I'll pull you back out, mine is very long, but it's going on the door. And then I just added a little frame at the top, because I didn't need to make another row just to make it the right length, so I just finished it off with that little trim. So that's where we're up to. Those of you that will be joining me for live lessons, we will be piecing it all together, and we will then look at how we're going to quilt it. So there's some exciting things coming across, because I think all that echo shape is going to lend itself to a little bit of free motion quilting, so don't go running screaming to the hills. We can have a look at it. So that's my little example of tessellation. See you soon.